I actually started by growing up near BC, about 5 miles away in Forest Hills, which is part of Jamaica Plain, and I went to St. Andrew's School, which was a grammar school that just had opened, and it was an Irish community. It was Irish in the sense that there were 16 boys and 23 girls in the class, and more than half had parents that came from Ireland, including my parents, who came from County Kerry and County Cork. And so after 8 years there, 16 boys, 8 went to BC High. And BC High was located in the South End at that time, the original BC campus, as we're in the 151st year now. It was the old school. This is where Boston College started. And the campus was nothing. There were some basketball hoops there, but there were lally poles holding up the building you would crash into if you didn't watch out. And so, but the school was magnificent, and we were mostly Jesuit teachers, and my first teachers were Father Leo. David Leo was a magnificent man. And so first year learning Latin, and then second year we had Latin and Greek, and mostly languages, one math course each semester, and of course theology. This is where I got started with Jesuits and their impact on me. I started there when I was 12 years old, and they had an ad down at BC High saying the Boston College Band needs members, and I could play the drums. I was in a drum and bugle corps out in Mattapan Square. The KSC had a drum and bugle corps, and so I tried out, and I went over with a friend from the neighborhood, Tommy Dolan, who was a junior at BC High. And I took the T out, and you could see Boston College at that time from the T station. It was primarily the 4 major buildings, and there was a pathway up to St. Mary's, and you walked onto the campus. There was no curbing, beautiful linden trees, nevertheless, and beautiful campus. And I tried out for the band. I was 12 years old, and the director said, no, you can play, but, we'd never pass as a BC kid. But Tom Dolan did make it. He couldn't play an instrument, so they gave him cymbals. And Tom went on to Holy Cross after BC, but his claim to fame in life is that he graduated from Holy Cross but played in the BC band. And so this was my first seeing BC, and just enthralled by its beauty, just the main Gothic 4 buildings. There were some army buildings and things like that. So graduating from BC High, I was 17 and very skinny and didn't know what to do. I had 2 older brothers, and there were 2 younger people as well. So I went in the Marine Corps. But to get into the Marine Corps, you had to have someone sign for you. And the recruiting sergeant said, will your parents sign? I said, well, if you tell my mother that they go to Mass every day at Paris Island, she would sign. And the guy came on, of course, and told my mom that. And I ended up going in the Marine Corps for 2 years, which was a wonderful experience. Then came out to BC when I was 19. And in my junior year, in my sophomore year, I would be turning 21. So I was able to apply for a job at the Alumni Association down on 74 Commonwealth Avenue. They needed a resident person to stay there, but they had a liquor license, and they needed someone to bring liquor around to set up bars, etc. And they had a number of social events. So I was selected for that job by a priest named Father Frank Sullivan, who was a naval chaplain in the Marine Corps, and he became a friend of mine for life. And so I got to see everybody in the inside of BC working at the Alumni Association. Virtually, I moved in and stayed there for 2 years. And one of my jobs between my junior and senior year was to work for the contractor building McElroy Commons. And it was a real tough job. And there were several football players and 2 hockey players. And after 2 weeks, they all quit because they were losing weight. And the person who was running the business said, I want a day's pay. And so gradually, I had to stay because the priest was bragging to Bill Flynn that Davy's still there, and the football players had left. So I stayed and got to participate in building McElroy Commons. they were building the bakery at that time, and the walls were this block that was a finished block, and it was a pale green on the 3rd floor. And I remember around 4:15 leaning against the wall that had just been built, and part of it fell down, and these were Italian guys who had just built it, and the one guy shouted at me, "Hey, you dumb son of a bitch," and the other guy said, "Hey, he's only a kid." And but that was a very significant experience working for the contractor. And somehow or other, my grades really started to improve after that. I was not skilled at being a laborer. So I graduated from BC, then got an MBA at UMass. They had a special one-year program, worked for 2 years, and then went to BC Law School, where I graduated in 1968. When I started BC Law School, I went around knocking on doors, basically, at all of the colleges and universities in Boston, and asked, do you need a teacher? Because I had an MBA at that time, and Simmons College did. So Simmons had a person who was going to be on sabbatical leave at that time, and so I taught a course, Marketing Research and Personal Finance. And the courses went very well. The numbers used to be low, and they became high because there was someone different, and the girls down there were interested in seeing something new. And basically, I taught at Simmons for 3 years, and it was a wonderful experience while I was at BC Law. And it was demanding, and it was a great situation to learn how to teach. And I learned sort of a conversational method. We taught the case method, and if I had conversations going, the class was very dynamic. And so I applied those principles even when I did come to BC thereafter. So I came to BC in 1968, and the rest is history. We are here now 46 years later. When we started off teaching, our teaching load was a 4-3. I taught 3 law courses and 1 marketing course, an introduction to marketing, since I had been teaching marketing at Simmons College. And so thereafter, I was able to just focus on law courses and taught the intro course and labor and employment law. But it was just labor law at that time. All of the employment laws basically were added. The major laws were added. The Civil Rights Act was 1964. I started teaching in 68. But the cases didn't get to the Supreme Court until the 70s. So that's when the major improvements and development of Title VII of the Civil Rights Act occurred. So I started teaching 4 classes in 3, and then 3-3. And I started my research. But our focus at that time was mostly teaching. And so I wrote an article that was published in the Business Law Review. Another business law association out on the West Coast asked if they could republish it. And then I sort of got the bug that it was a fun thing to do, and started my research and writing. And eventually, I was invited by Southwestern Publishing to see if I could revive a book that had gone fallow. And this book was simply called Labor Law, and it was by Muller and Myers. Howard Myers was a PhD in economics down at Northeastern, and so he didn't have an interest in the book anymore, and Muller had been bought out maybe 12 years before that. So this was an opportunity for me to start on labor and employment law. There were 4 editions before I took over in the 5th edition. And so we're now in the 15th edition, and the book has grown from labor law to labor and employment law. With the great success of the first Twomey edition of labor law, the publisher asked me if I would write a chapter for a person, Ronald Anderson, who was doing their business law with a person named Walter Kumpf. And I wrote a chapter on employment, and then they asked me if I would serve on that book. And so I started to serve on the business law book as well, with Ronald Anderson and a person named Ivan Fox. So prior thereto, we had books in the business law department. The first books published at CBA, the College of Business Administration, the first books were by business law teachers. A person, Jim Carey, was a magnificent man who wrote the first business law book, and he was joined by Jim Shaw. And Jim Shaw was a Marine major from World War II, graduated from Xavier University out in Cincinnati and Harvard Law School, got a master's in tax from BU School of Law. And Jim had adopted 11 children. And his goal was to, and these were multiracial. Some had difficulties, others didn't, and they didn't have children of their own. They purchased an inn out in Dunstable, Mass. And Jim was extraordinary. He would work around the clock. His goal was to get each of these kids a home, their own home. But he lost his health. And he was always telling me, David, you got to watch your health. And so he got sick and couldn't teach. And the business law department members, Bill Hickey, Van Harrington, Al Sutherland, and others, they all took his courses. There was no, let's say, compensation structure. When Jim was sick, he couldn't teach. These guys taught his courses, and he continued to be paid. So it was just everyone pitching in those days, again, focusing on teaching. And so Jim had a book that needed upgrading, and this is how I started actually my first book, and it was over here, Managerial Law of Consumer Protection, Trademarks, and Unfair Competition. And so this was a very nice experience, basically learning intellectual property law and applying it and updating Jim Shaw's book. And I dedicated it to this person, Veronica Lynch of Lake Placid, who was my wife at that time. So Jim was married to a person named Mary Crowley, this wonderful lady who cared for these 11 adopted kids. And so Jim wanted to, and did the next books dedicated to Mary Crowley. But just to have to reflect, our business law department would have to reflect on Jim Shaw as just an extraordinary man, as the other people there, just always just pitching in, but focusing primarily on a teaching department. In maybe 1972 or so, Van Harrington went to a meeting of business law professors. They had met occasionally from time, and so Van told me about this, and I went, and then started to go to a national convention called the American Business Law Association. Now it's the Academy of Legal Studies and Business. And I met a person there, Ed Tucker, who was from Yukon. And Ed Tucker asked me if I would restart this association that would meet sometimes and not meet other times. And we would then meet at Conley House each year. And basically, Ed became the president of the Academy of Legal Studies and Business. So he would be our guest speaker. We'd have about 20 to 25 people at Conley House, and Ed would be our guest speaker and tell us what was going on in the Academy. And we would do papers there, and gradually we have developed that organization into quite an organization of people in the entire Northeast going up. We have people from Canada that join occasionally and then drop out. But that's where we come up with North Atlantic. So we have this association. This is how I got started in sort of an association of other business law professors. And gradually we ended up getting to know people in the community, and we do that to this day, have lots of, maybe every 3 or 4 years we'll have a major meeting at Boston College, and we continue to edit our publication here at Boston College each year. So I think that brings us up to date with the start of things. These are the topics that I have been writing about. So international law. And so, of course, I had a course in international law at BC Law School. But it was old, and I started to retool, so I had to write something about international law, and this would be my process would be, I'd write several articles about a topic that I would be writing about, and from those topics I would be using some of that in the textbook, but getting command of the subject matter. So international law was a major challenge for me because it was just basically one course. And then the next chapter that I write on is torts. And torts is a first semester law school course, 2 semesters, and torts is the law of basically wrongs. This is what civil wrongs. This is what professors spend so much time on the first year, and students as well, on the law of torts, intentional torts, negligence, strict liability. And so we have just one chapter on it, and this is usually a magnificent chapter talking about assault and battery civilly, intentional torts, defamation, right to privacy, negligence, and strict liability. So then the next chapter we do is intellectual property law. And intellectual property law is copyrights, patents, trademarks, and there's so much that you can research and write about, and so many of my articles have focused on Chapter 10, the intellectual property chapters. And now we have contracts, and we've got 9 chapters on contracts, and contracts is really the cornerstone of our legal system. And when Russia had been trying to advance its membership in the World Trade Organization, they was very, very reluctant to take them in because they didn't live up to their contracts. Now we can see that that is a cultural thing, I think, these days. And so the law of contracts is so important. We spend half of our basic course on contract law. And so this is a great area of subject matter, and an area where I spend time researching and writing. Then we have personal property and bailments. And so these are the joint tenancies, the way you can own property. And the law of bailments is when you store that mink coat of yours and you go back to claim it, the person didn't have title to it, but had possession of your property. And what are your rights when that person can't find that mink coat? And so many other things where people take possession to repair something and they don't do a good job, or it's lost or destroyed. So then we get into legal aspects of supply chain management, which is really just another complicated chapter. It talks about the law of carriers, their obligation to carry goods and their liability, and it's really connected to the law of bailments in many respects. And then the law of warehouses, what are their responsibilities? And you can see in business how these subjects would be important: warehousing and carrier law. So then my next chapter is insurance. I don't think I've ever written an article on insurance, but insurance is very important. And Ben Harrington used to teach a course on insurance, and he also taught a course on real estate. But depending on Ben's stories for the day, you got real estate stories and insurance stories in real estate. And so this was a favorite topic of mine because I love Ben as a teacher and as a colleague. So then we get to the law of agency. And agency is, we know about agents representing athletics and athletes. And so an agent is a person who represents a principal. And agents sometimes, make a lot of mistakes. And what about their mistakes? Are they relegated to the principal? And the answer is yes. And from agency law comes something that is old-fashioned sounding. It's called master-servant relationships. And master-servant relationships is really employer-employee law today. And the employer is responsible for the torts of the employee. Okay, so that's sort of rule number 1. It's the doctrine of respondeat superior. So we've got a couple of terrific chapters involving agency law. Then that gets us to employment law in this book here, and this is a chapter that's double in size of the other chapters, and you can know why, because I love it, but moreover because there's just so much law there. There's constantly in my lifetime, there were just so many laws passed, and so we kept on adding to that chapter as new laws came in. Chapter 40 is on equal employment opportunity law. And again, this is all new. This is the Civil Rights Act of 64, but the cases started coming 71, 72, and to this day. And so that's a major chapter in our book. Then we get to business organizations, and we talk about, sole proprietorships, partnerships, and corporations, limited liability companies. And so there's special law dealing with partnership law. Limited liability company gives you the limited liability of a corporation, but it's for tax purposes. It commonly can be used as a partnership. And then we have all of the things that happen with business organizations, and that's another 3 chapters. And then there's another chapter within that on securities law, which is another big ballpark. So these are all subjects that I can get to write about, and I would write about just simply trying to, when new cases would come out, I would see something that would be interesting to me, see it something new for my books, and so I would research and write about it. Sonia, you sometimes would talk to me about the Daily Labor Report. I'm going to go to that because this was basically my source of finding out information about labor and employment law. This was on a daily basis, and I'd save materials every day, it seemed, and then have so much when I got to my book that I would spend maybe a whole summer squeezing it down so I could revise the book. But my research for my business law books would very often be over at BC Law School looking at the advance sheets, what we used to call advance sheets. They now have some new names for it, but they're sort of on the way out, advance sheets. And so West Publishing publishes early editions. They're just in paperback, like a newspaper form. And when they get enough, they'll do a bound volume of that book for all of the 50 states and the federal courts. And so I go through these advance sheets, and I look for cases that are interesting and save these. And this takes an awful lot of time. And basically, you're looking at every case that's decided. And what I'm looking for cases for the textbooks are cases that have pizzazz, that they have a famous person, Chris Guile, from the movie now and the best-selling book. He was sued by Jesse Ventura and lost the case, but he had been murdered, so he couldn't testify. And somehow or other, I'm believing his version over Jesse Ventura. But he lost the case, and so we have that now coming up. It's going to be in our new edition of the book in the Chapter 9 on defamation. So you find all of the exciting things, and so what we think makes our book better than all the others out in the marketplace is, we've got good stuff, and the good stuff doesn't come from just the major cases, but they come from cases that are ordinary cases with people that are not ordinary, that are unusual, that the kids can, the students can get excited about. And so this comes from this process of not computer, but just flipping through, and you can do it so efficiently. They tell you what's new in the book, and they'll tell you under defamation or tort law, right? And you'll see defamation, you'll see the name Ventura, and you'll see that I always like to have a person win the case, so that if the person wins the case, then there's a teaching value to that. The student's going to see, well, you can't do that. See, that person won a judgment in that particular case. So most of the time, people don't win on these appeals. So I select, and of course I've got cases in that prove a negative as well, so when you don't win, what you should be watching out for. So this research is old-fashioned, but very efficient to find that you can go just flip through and you can spot something of character, something that's going to work for your textbook for undergraduates. My professional experiences, so writing about labor and employment law, but the book was simply called Labor Law for a while, and then we added employment as we went forward when we had enough subject matter on that, and actually broke off a paperback book from that on employment law. So I decided that I would like to be an arbitrator. And so I had written now on the subject matter. And so there is the National Railroad Adjustment Board out in Chicago, and there's the National Mediation Board down in Washington, D.C. And the National Mediation Board was part of the Railway Labor Act of 1926 and has been amended a number of times. And so if the parties can agree on an arbitrator, then the National Mediation Board would appoint. And so the parties themselves hate to have the Mediation Board appoint people. So they, with that threat of the board appointing someone, they will go along and work it out themselves and select someone. And so doing my research on labor and employment law, I thought this might be an interesting way to start as a labor arbitrator. And so I wrote to the chairman of the National Mediation Board, a person named David Stowe, and he interviewed me, and I brought down a copy of my book, and he told me that basically to be an arbitrator you have to be experienced, but there's no way you can get experience, people trying out a young person. So this is in 1974. And so he told me some things to do, and about 2 weeks later I did all those things and wrote back to him and told him how, I got it down. And so there was, out in Chicago, the National Railroad Adjustment Board had a docket of cases that the parties themselves couldn't agree on, so he was able to appoint me to a board out there. And so from that experience of working on cases out on the National Railroad Adjustment Board, people got to see my work, and they selected me thereafter. So since 1974, I've been doing cases in the railroad and airline industry under the Railway Labor Act, and the party selecting me, and I don't think I ever had to be appointed again. And so that was a wonderful experience to start. And then with that experience, there was a program at the University of Michigan Law School where they were taking young arbitrators. Most arbitrators at that time had been from the War Labor Board, older people now, and they were trying to get younger people in, trying to get women, trying to get minorities. And there were enough Irish Catholics around, but they wanted to make it so, that it wasn't a special program. It was going to be drawn from all sectors of society. So they had an Irish Catholic guy, and so there were 16 people in the program, and it was sponsored by General Electric and the IUE, the International Union of Electrical Workers, and these people represent all of General Electric employees that are craft-related. So I was in this program for 2 years and got started as an arbitrator in the Boston area, for example, and did cases over the years for General Electric and the IUE. And I was able to this was in the heyday of arbitration. Arbitration now was new. This is in the mid-'70s. And it was a wonderful experience. Did cases with the Boston Police, many cases with the Boston Police, and their special union there. I think I might have had 8 cases going at one time or another, and this was when there was Mayor White was there, and the union was fighting with the commissioner, and it was a full employment situation for arbitrators. I did wonderful cases with the International and Longshoremen's Union in the Boston waterfront, and got to meet such wonderful, wonderful characters. The first docket of cases I did there were 16 cases, and the union lost every single one of them. And I was always looking with great care, saying, oh, my goodness, these people will never have me back again. This is one of the things about an arbitrator now, that the parties select you. And if they don't agree with you or if they don't like your decisions, you're never selected again. And this is one of the remarkable things about the railroad and airline industry, 1974, and still people, I now, the industry knows my work, and if they have a big issue, they'll say, would you take it? And lately I've been saying no, but it will go to Florida or someplace good. And so But the Longshoremen called me again, and they had both members, the president of the union and the person who was in charge of the Boston Shipping Associations. They said, "Professor, would you take some more cases?" And I said, "Well, I would, but I'm surprised that," I said to this guy, his name was Hankard, Mr. Hankard would have me back, since they lost all those cases. He said, "Oh, Professor, I didn't think we were going to win any of those fucking cases." And I thought they intended to win every single one of the cases they had. Judge Joe Feeney was representing them. He was a part-time judge, and they changed that in process. That didn't work. He would represent them in injury cases and just a character. And so anyway, I continued to do some most unusual cases for them, but traveled throughout New England, traveled to all of the paper mills. I think I was to every paper mill in Maine, in New Hampshire, Vermont, and just hospitals down in Memphis, Tennessee. Just remarkable. Going out to Portland, Oregon, to do a case and wondering why they would have me, or going out to Great Falls, Montana, in late January. And saying, what an experience that was to get off the plane, and it was 24 below zero. And a guy came up to pick me up in a van. He was smoking a cigarette, no hat, and his jacket was open. But it was not a 24 degree that we know. And so, but it was just an experience to go throughout the country and meet all the people that one would meet. And I have this first volume here of cases. I've got 26 volumes that I have bound. And I had a student one time go through and see how many people. So the cases that you do as an arbitrator are contract interpretation. And there are standards for making those contract determination decisions. And then discipline or discharge. And so I've got well over 2,000 cases, and I wondered how many people I gave their jobs back to, and with back pay and without back pay, and I know that number, but I never looked at that. It was always who's right, and so. This is the rule, for being an arbitrator. What's right? What's right? Always what's right, and sometimes parties don't want to hear what's right. And very often in the railroad industry, you'll have, you're the neutral member and chairman of the board, and there'll be a carrier member and an employee member. And always at the end of every case, I will sit down and talk to them about what I'm thinking, correct me if I'm wrong, and telling them that they're both arbitrators and we have to do what's right, because if we don't do what's right, it's going to mess up the system. If we interpret the contract wrong, then people think that they can go to arbitration and get relief when they shouldn't get relief, because the contract doesn't carry the words that it would give them that relief. So it's quite challenging, but it converts nicely to teaching labor and employment law. And also, when you're reading that daily labor report, when you read a decision by a court of appeals, very often these people don't have, the judges don't have the expertise, and you wonder, how could they do that? How could they make a decision like that? My articles lately have been on topics that have really ticked me off. And just sort of transitioning just to a couple of recent articles, there were 18 licensed practical nurses working in the Lakeland nursing home down in Florida. And they were not being cared for properly, and they wanted to form a union. And the ownership of the nursing home challenged. They said, no, these people are professionals, not professionals, they're supervisors. Supervisors are not protected under the Act. And so these were every single licensed practical nurse. This is the lowest level of nursing care, and a registered nurse, and then management above that. Registered nurses are protected. Their professional employees are protected under the Act. At the same time, out in Seattle, Washington, professional engineers, some of them making over $100 an hour were protected, and these women making $16 an hour and very, very little benefits were not going to be protected. And the courts came out and said that the labor board was wrong in making the decision that they were protected. Well, I went into a tithy about that, wrote a kicking butt article about that, and so you'll see a lot of these things that come from maybe reading the Daily Labor Report and spotting things that are wrong, and then my publications usually are ending up now in the strike that in the Labor Law Journal. And they have been publishing my articles as the lead article for the last 6 years. So, they're usually good topics. And if you're an arbitrator, very often you want to be cautious in what you're saying. But you get to this stage of life where you want to you don't want cases anymore, basically. You just want to do what's right. And so that's basically, I think, the motivation, and sort of just being a BC person, going back to BC High, BC Law, trying to do what's right. And that's always our motivation. So I have to go maybe to now 1985 or so. So I've been doing cases under the Railway Labor Act since 1974. And I get a call. I'm doing a case down in New Orleans, and I'm going to return the call later. And Kathy, maybe your mom called me. She was a secretary at BC, but I'm not sure. We had her. We were fortunate enough to have her at that time. But I got a call from BC that the White House was calling, and I'm thinking this is a joke from one of my pals in the neighborhood. And ultimately, I got a call from the National Mediation Board, and they said, "Would you serve on a mediation, on a presidential emergency board?" And I said, "This is now. The summer is coming on." And I had promised my wife, so when you're doing these things, this is a 7-day-a-week work week, but it's okay because you're working at home. You get up at 5:30 in the morning, and you work on your stuff, and you have time for your children. Anyway, I'm telling the person from the mediation board when he called me, I'm not sure that I can do this because my wife will kill me, because I was going to spend time this summer. And the guy screamed at me, said, "When your country calls, you answer." And I said, "Yes, sir." Okay, so I did this during the summer. And this was Presidential Emergency Board 211. And in this particular board, there were 110 employees represented by 6 different unions, and all of the carriers bargain, all of the railroads bargain as one body through let's call it an action committee down in Washington, D.C. And so the unions like this, and there is consistency throughout the industry, and so they put on a case over 30 days, and I served with 2 other individuals, and we actually did an excellent job. And we were fortunate to do an excellent job because we were dealing with 6 unions, but there perhaps are maybe 14 unions in the railroad industry, and maybe 4 or 5 of them had already agreed on something, but they had different ways. They were operating crafts. They get paid based on miles and hours, and the other people we were represented were hourly employees. So it was very hard to tell anyone what a pattern would be in that industry, what percentage increase they were going to get. And so we got to a formula that showed there was a pattern. And instead of making suggestions, a framework, we decided we would write the contract language for them. And so after 30 days of working around the clock, we gave them our report, and we knew we had nailed it. And so the parties loved it. And I remember in the Wall Street Journal, the vice president of the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers said, "It could have been better, it could have been worse. You nailed it." And so this was a contract applied nationwide to 6 labor organizations, 110,000 workers, and it lasted until 1991, and later 1992. Some of these unions were continuing to bargain, so it lasted for a long time. And so, but in 1991, it was an economic downturn, And there was great difficulty in giving employees anything, and the employer was trying to cut back. They had crews on a regular freight train would have a locomotive engineer, a head brakeman, and a fireman. On the end of the freight train, there'd be a conductor and a rear brakeman. And so the crew would have 5 members on there. And the carriers wanted to cut it down to 3, cut it down to 4 at least. And so there was a lot of money to be saved because the big cost in railroad operations is the labor cost. And so they were able to get some concessions in 1991. And so in 1992, everyone was feeling, that was terrible. And so I was selected to serve on 3 boards that year, presidential emergency boards. And the employees didn't do that well. And so one union, this was the International Association of Machinists, struck CSX Transportation. And then all of the other employers, all of the other railroads in the country locked out their employees. They had an agreement that if you strike one of us, we're going to lock everyone else out. So there's a nationwide strike going on. And Congress is holding hearings. And my neighbor's a retired person from Gillette came out on the deck to say, "Dave, you bastard, they're in there talking about what you did to them, how you screwed them." And but the pattern was from 1991. Again, this is how there's consistency. If you can show a pattern, people can accept that. And so the employees didn't do that well in 1992. And anyway, but somehow or other I didn't get blamed for this because the people in 1991 get blamed for this, the first people who reduced the crews, etc. And so then this was George Bush. President Reagan was the first appointment, then George Bush in 92. And then President Clinton appointed me as chairman of 2 boards. And one was nationwide, and the other one was the Soo Line which is owned by Canadian Pacific Rail, CP Rail, and they run in 11 states. And they had a strike out there for 58 days. And so we held hearings, and to make a long story short, there were patterns out there, and they knew what the right answer was, and I knew what the right answer was. But the board members were political appointments, and they didn't know anything about this. And they wanted to give the union more, and one guy wanted to give the company what they wanted. And so what I had to do was make friends with them, explain to them, look, we got to be right. The most important thing is right. If you give someone more, it's going to disrupt the entire industry. This thing is not going to work in the future. So I remember going to St. Matthew's Cathedral down in Washington, D.C., and I make a contribution there each year. Because when you're the chairman of the board, they refer to it as the Twomey board. And down in the South, they call it the Twomey board, okay, Dr. Twomey. And so Dr. Twomey, his board, it was important that we got it right. And somehow or other I was able to get these guys to be my friends and say, look, don't do this to me. Let's do the pattern. And they did the pattern. And so I continue to be in touch with these guys, send them Christmas cards, and send a donation to St. Matthew's Cathedral. St. Francis of Assisi, there's a beautiful chapel down there. It's very soothing. And these guys are arguing, we should give them this, we should give them that, and they're fighting with each other. And there was a pattern out there that we had to give them, like everyone else got. And so eventually, with the calm that Francis of Assisi brought, we were able to get the right answer. And so these boards turned out just fine. This was a big surprise. There were seldom were there presidential emergency boards in the airline industry because they didn't do nationwide bargaining, and the parties themselves were always giving each other the best possible deal at that time. They were always nudging up. They would look and see what the patterns were and then give a little more. And everyone was happy with this. So after 9/11, all of the employees for United Airlines had contracts except the machinist. And the machinist didn't have a contract because there was another union that was formed, the Fraternal Order of Machinists, that had organized and thrown the machinist out, the IAM, out of Northwest Airlines. And the machinists were not only representing these skilled mechanics who were licensed, who could shut a plane down if they didn't like what they saw. They also had baggage handlers. And so they were saying they had anyone that would do anything. They would have different let us say, locals. But the Fraternal Order of Machinists were saying, we're professionals. We got to come down there and we're going to take over United Airlines. So the Machinist Union didn't know how to agree. And so everyone had a new contract before 9/11. Except the machinist organization. After 9/11, they're negotiating, and United Airlines is just burning cash. People are not flying. The planes they're locked into how many people are on the crew. They're locked into so many things in their contract, and so they just couldn't agree on anything. And so it's getting towards Christmas time, and the union's going to strike at Christmas time, the machinist union. And so the National Mediation Board tells the president there's going to be a strike, and then the president appoints. And I was so fortunate enough to be appointed to this board, which was really a surprise because it was, basically not the industry and my primary background. And so, but then you find out why I was appointed. There was a person representing, United Airlines, and people that you got to know over time that you could get a feel for what was right, what was wrong. And so we were able to propose something that got them through the Christmas period. And basically, there was a pattern around. And we said, look, everyone knows that all the other unions are going to have to give back if they're going to get to be able to fly profitably. And so we made a suggestion, or our recommendation was that we're going to give you the pattern like everyone else got. And then you are going to be locked in to what everyone else gives back. And so this was something that I'm not sure they could live with, but they couldn't strike, and they didn't want to strike because they had something that the board said. And so Evans and Novak wrote a national column. And I think Evans had died at that time, and they were writing it out of the Chicago Sun-Times. And so after we issued our award and recommendation, and the White House was really working with this one, okay, and they knew what we were doing. And so after we issued our award, the Sun-Times had basically an article saying, Presidential Emergency Board screws the president, okay? And so they listed the members and didn't give our full qualifications. Professor David Twomey of Boston College, And but this was all, put up because the union didn't know what to do. And so Novak wrote out of Chicago. United Airlines, their headquarters is in Chicago. And somehow or other they were able to get to the Sun-Times to write, I'm sure management and the union got together and said, look, say these guys screwed us, screwed management, screwed the president, okay? So that the union would then accept what we're going to recommend, okay? And so can you imagine that? So it's such pride I have in that article, that this is a way to get, ratification. The theory behind it. No one told me that actually happened. Now, I have to tell you that. But, knowing how things work, I'm sure it happened. And so that was sort of interesting. And so after that, I've done a couple of additional emergency boards. One, most recently with President Obama, just a small one with Southeastern Pennsylvania. SEPTA and the engineers down there, which we were able to resolve rather easily. And so, but these 9 boards with 5 presidents, really is sort of something I guess I'm proud of. And it's fortuitous, to have that first 211, this is the 1986 Presidential Emergency Board, work so well. And I think sometimes, when parties were fighting, I'd invite them to Boston College. I think they might like to come to Boston College more so than like what I was telling them they had to do. But this is really a bit unusual. So the Railway Labor Act of 1926, and there are over that time throughout the entire country, there have been 247 boards. And for someone to do 9 and to have 5 presidents appoint you, is just fortuitous. It's just sheer, good luck. And having maybe the system to understand, look for patterns. People can accept patterns. They're treated consistently. And if you need someone has got some hurt, that there's some special hurt there, tweak it, make an adjustment, and then hide it. And you can hide things in contracts. And the parties accept that, and they know that there's something wrong, and we got to get it done right. Some of my accomplishments really occurred as an undergraduate, building McElroy Commons, and to see how distressed I was, to see in the master plan that they were thinking of taking that down. And I had seen Father Mike Walsh raise the money. It was done basically at the Alumni Hall down on 74 Commonwealth Avenue. And to see what went into that, and maybe they had some debt from that, which was really part of the big problem that Father Joyce ran into when he was the president. Debt was due. The contractor, John Bowen, had built the Shattuck Hospital, Columbia Point, and you could make a lot of money then if you're a contractor. There wasn't good accounting and auditing, et cetera. I'm sure there was some. And John King wanted to do things for BC, and he was treating BC very fairly. And with Father Joyce taking over, maybe I heard his executive assistant said, we got to put things out to bid, and John King got mad because John actually had, he was the person who was running John Bowen, the contractor, said, after all I've done for you guys, pay me. And so then the debt that was floating in there that he wasn't worried about getting paid ended up being called for, and John Smith was able to come and do a way of funding that and resolve that problem. But so I have great pride in being part of building McElroy Commons and not being their best worker, but showed up every day and didn't get fired. And lots of people got fired there. And then living at Alumni Hall and getting to know so many people, get to know Father Maxwell, who was a friend of Father Sullivan, and Bill Donahue, who was the president of Holy Cross and came down to BC as an assistant professor, not as a full professor, and taught theology, and this wonderful, this articulate man. And got to meet so many of the friends of Father Sullivan who would come to visit with him. And basically, I would drive him places. He was not a good driver at that time. He would point the car and had some hypertension and would get mad at us sometimes for not shoveling the snow, but we always shoveled. One day, we had just shoveled. We had gone to Arch Street to church and came back, and Father slipped. He didn't have good balance. And I said, Father, we just shoveled. He said, well, you don't think I was fool enough to blame myself? And then he started to smile, because he didn't want, had fallen and was blaming us. But met wonderful people. That Father Sullivan married my wife and me, and was just a magnificent person. All of the people that I met at Alumni Hall, and gave me a structure here at BC, got me to be able to see, how the Jesuits, the impact. In the old days, the grades were really not that good, and we had lots of great Jesuits who would, be stern graders, but write wonderful letters, and most importantly, they would call people for you. And one time I got a ticket, and Father Sullivan called, a speeding ticket, going down a hill, doing an errand for him in my 1939 Ford that I bought for $50. And Father Sullivan called the station over in Dorchester and said, this is Father Sullivan from the college. One of my boys got a ticket. And he said, no problem, Father, taken care of. That's when BC was still, Boston's college. It was transitioning at that time, getting bigger as it had to get bigger to make it economically viable, in Father Joyce's time. time. And so it was wonderful being a student here and working here as well, as a student, and then coming back and seeing how the College of Business Administration just blossomed at the College of Business Administration. In 1968, I started serving on the promotion committee and was able to see for, I guess, 24 years, and then one hiatus, and then 25 overall all years serving on promotion and tenure committee. You got to see everyone, and this is with Jack Newhouser. By the way, when we were searching for a dean, I was chairman of the search committee, ran the entire thing. There were no outside consultants in those days, and I would sit down with Father Donovan, and as we brought in candidates, and Father would tell me that person from UMass Amherst who came with a leather jacket was not going to fly down in Boston. And so I would go back to the committee and somehow or other try to tell the committee without telling that Father Donovan told me that Father Monin and him didn't think that guy was going to work. And maybe I did mention the leather jacket, and several people got mad at me because I didn't have the right answer. But he was a pretty good guy, but he wasn't going to work as BC's guy in the business community in Boston. And so we had the blizzard of '78, and a person from Buffalo was being interviewed. He had been teaching at Berkeley. He came to Buffalo with the strawberry shortcake, he explained, as a chaired professorship, and decided that Buffalo was not for him. And I said, we got a big storm coming. And he said, no problem, I'm from Buffalo, I'm coming down. So he came down, and we met with him that day and took him to supper at the Red Coach Grill. It was on over in Newton Corner. And needless to say, the blizzard was in full force. I had a '77 Volkswagen at that time and drove to the Wollaston liquor store and couldn't get out to Squantum where I lived, and stayed there for 3 days, not at the liquor store all night, but then I'll eventually get back. But this fellow was in Boston for eight days. Jack Newhouser was acting dean at that time, and Jack became a very good friend of this person. And so after our great search, basically Father Monin thought that Jack was doing a great job, and Jack turned out to be a dean that lasted for 22 years. So I take a little pride in the fact that we were able to select Jack as chairman of that committee. So, there are wonderful things that have happened here at BC, and just to see it grow right now, but most importantly, just to see the spirit here, to see the culture, to see all of the things that now fill in. Faculty used to do everything, and there are so many support things here at BC today. And so I made a trip to Nicaragua, met so many great people, but the people that run the intercessions, for example, how important it is to build a community, to make Boston College still feel like it's a college and it's working somehow or other. We've got our various schools, but it just simply continues to work. Father Neenan was a great part of that, but there are just so many people now that do great things here, building the community and maintaining the community. So I'm delighted to be here. I'm so delighted to have Father Monin and all his work, but Father C.V. Joyce, was here when I first came. He was a friend of mine. I knew him from the citizens programs that he would run. People would come out to BC, and I would run those bars. As a matter of fact, there'd be 15 bartenders, and we would pour rye, scotch, bourbon, and we could basically, have 500 people served in 10 minutes, and they would come back for a little more. But Father Joyce was a magnificent man, and he just was left with too many problems, and Father Monin came in, and John Smith and Frank Campanella, just all from the Carroll. Well, Frank from the Carroll School at that time, CBA we were calling it at that time. So some great leadership. Father Leahy does a magnificent job these days. You never think that after Father Monin, you could have Father Leahy, after Stan Musial or Ted Williams or Babe Ruth, all in this league that we have now for our leadership. So I'm just delighted to be here, and thank you for listening to me.